the greatest basketball player of all time? Is it Michael Jordan? Is it LeBron James? Birds? Magic? Bill Walton? This is the sort of question that we could have a lively debate over beer and chicken wings and figure out, that. What about the greatest composer? Mozart? Bach? Springsteen? That question probably deserves a lively debate too, maybe over wine this time. This is probably less of a good question for this crowd, but what about the greatest Pokemon? We had more answers at the first service, but that's good for a debate over juice boxes. The greatest commandments? This question, the one which with Jesus is tested in the gospel, this is not even complicated enough to fuel a beverage-lubricated debate. The answer that Jesus gives, which is the right one, is not terribly original. He did not invent this line. He quotes it from Deuteronomy chapter 6. It's a passage called the Shema. It's one which every Jew standing around him that day would have known by heart. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. That is the first and greatest commandment, which was the question. But Jesus just keeps on going. And the second is like unto it. Love your neighbor as yourself. It seems like an unasked for bonus answer. Did Jesus not understand the question? Was he looking for extra credit? I was that kind of student. I used to do this. I'd answer the question. I'd just keep going. I'd be like, let's see if teacher can give me something extra on this thing. Is that what he's doing? Or is it actually that the lawyer, and maybe we, didn't understand what we were asking, what we were looking for? We thought maybe the greatest thing could stand alone. But Jesus teaches that the greatest commandment cannot actually stand alone. It's actually inseparable from the second one. Loving your neighbor like yourself is not a bonus, but it's part and parcel of the great commandment itself. It's like the other side of the same coin. Or it should be. But it turns out the commandments, they turn out to be less inseparable than coins. It's really hard to get just the head part of the coin. But sometimes, even well-meaning religious people can really emphasize one of the sides, the love your God or love your neighbor side. To treat the greatest commandments in isolation from the second like unto it is like separating food from pleasure. I mean, you can do it. They make those synthetic meal drinks now. The green one is called Soylent. Do they not read the book? Anyway, but it's called Soylent, and it's like a green goo. You can drink this, and you will live, but you will be unhappy. I mean, most people intuitively know something has gone wrong when they're presented with a glass of green goo. You can separate sex from the relationship, but not without denigrating the act and the person. You can separate work from meaning, but not without making people miserable and depressed. Similarly, you can separate love of God and love of neighbor, but not without negative consequences. I'd venture that most of us probably lean one way or the other. That we have a tendency to veer in one direction, the love of God or love of neighbor direction as we live out our faith. I venture that's part of why Jesus actually refused to name one thing apart from the other. But what happens to get him out of balance? What are the symptoms of being out of kilter on this love of God, love of neighbor question? Because if we can figure out the symptoms, if we know something about the symptoms, then we might be able to spot them in ourselves. And it may just be that Jesus is trying to tell us how to fix them. So let's start with what happens when we ignore is too much. Just downplay the love of neighbor piece, the second commandment. We'll start there because that seems to have been maybe the chief problem Jesus had with the Pharisees. Even with the lawyer who was coming to him to test him. The one who he wouldn't let off the hook just by answering his question. It's Deuteronomy 6, man, go away. Like, he won't do that, right? So, just like any disease, there are multiple symptoms, but the most common, when we emphasize the love of God purely and downplay the love of neighbor, is a dry perfectionism. Now, I was thinking about these as I was preparing the sermon. I went to the book of Revelation, which may seem like a strange place to go, but I went there because in the beginning of the book, there are messages to 7 churches that the angel gives to John. And for each church, the angel has something to say about how that church is doing. And I went to go see, are there churches there that have apparently really emphasized the love of God and downplayed the love of neighbor, or have really emphasized the love of neighbor and downplayed the love of God? And it turns out that there are. Right? And the church in Ephesus gets a message from the Lord that says this. It says, you've been really good at the God thing. You've been excellent at testing the false prophets, at kicking them out, and making sure you're believing rightly. You even hate the heresy of the Nicolaitans, whatever that was. They're really good about the God thing. But, the angel says, you have abandoned the love you had at first. And what they have to do, the angel says, is repent and go back to the works they had done at the beginning. They had to get back to the love your neighbor place. They had become this kind of dry, correct, but dry perfectionist church that had ceased to love one another. Now, I think this happens. The love of God by itself ends up in this dry, prideful perfectionism because we treat religion and our relationship with God in these absolute but abstract kind of terms. It makes it really easy to judge our neighbors instead of loving them because the most important thing to us is how are we thinking about and loving God? So you have to judge your neighbor when they worship wrong or pray wrong or believe wrong. And the Pharisees often come under fire from Jesus about this. They're very good at knowing like the right amount of cumin to tithe, but less good about knowing what to do with like the blind and the prisoners and the crippled in their midst. Christians, though, have also been good about this. There's a story of 2 Dominican friars in the town of Avila in Spain at the time of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, the Dominicans were the order that ran the Spanish Inquisition. And one of the 2 friars was on the tribunal. He was an inquisitor. And the other was just a mendicant monk, just a wandering, begging monk. But they're walking together, and the mendicant says to the inquisitor, says, you know, when it used to be when I walked through this town, people were warm and friendly, and they wanted to see us. But now they avert their gaze and they shrink back whenever we walk by. And he said, why is that? He said, what do you think their averted gazes mean? Do they have hidden heresies? Perhaps, the inquisitor says. The mendicant says, then you are wrong. It means that the robes of our order have been associated with the public burnings of heretics to the exclusion of all else. And that's not as far removed from the way a lot of people think about Christians as I wish it was. You know, that we've been associated with the judging of people above all else. With this sort of perfectionism, this willingness to judge others, comes a lack of concern for the real problems facing the world, actually, at least a lack of effort beyond thoughts and prayers. And it happens because we don't really love our neighbors. We don't really see their needs. We make peace with the world as it is because we're so focused on the, us and God thing, the loving of God thing, we cease to see the world around us. This is how, on the Sunday morning in August of 1859, the Episcopalians of St. John's Church in Mobile, Alabama, all gathered together for worship, and they enjoyed their beautiful worship in their beautiful building. And while they were focused on loving God with all their heart and their soul and their mind, one of their members left service in the middle of church to go bring the Clotilda, which was the last slave ship to land on American shores, to go bring the Clotilda to safe harbor in the bay. Can you imagine that? Like leaving church to go bring the slave ship in? Now, I suppose it could have been any church, but it was an Episcopal church. And one of our weaknesses as a denomination historically has been a tendency to offer very robust and beautiful worship of an offering of our love of God without a correspondingly robust effort to love our neighbor. And this may seem counterintuitive, but when everything becomes about love of God and love of neighbor, the transcendent actually gets sucked out of our lives. Because our lives, you've surely noticed this, are mostly lived out there, where the people are, where the other human beings are. The Desert Fathers used to have this saying. They said, "If you have seen your brother, you have seen the Lord your God." So that idea has the capacity to transform every moment we experience in our life. And Jesus says this too, right? Like, in serving the least of these, you have served me. If in serving our neighbor, we are in the presence of Christ, then God suddenly becomes real and tangible all around us, and the world is not deprived of its transcendence, but infused with it all around us. So actually, when we lose the love of neighbor, we end up losing the God in our world all around us. Now, what about the other thing? What about, instead of being really good at the love of God and not so good at the love of neighbor, what if we flip it around? We get really good at the love of neighbor and downplay the love of God. Well, the place we eventually get to is angry exhaustion. Revelation has a church like this too. It's the church of Thyatira. Not a name I have to say very often. What the angel tells that church is that they are the best at doing good works and service. You guys are rocking it like your hands and feet program, out of the world, the angel says. Right? Way to go. But you've also become tolerant of all the stuff that contradicts the gospel. And this is not an accident. Right? These things go together. Because it's an outgrowth of putting love of neighbor way up on a pedestal and love of God down. And what it will leave them with, the solution is they have to get serious about the love of God thing again. What it will leave them with is this angry exhaustion. Because we'll find that the church can't do enough, that God isn't doing enough. And everything religiously gets measured by effectiveness. How much can we change and fix the lives of our neighbors, and we can't get there. We can try as hard as we can exhaust ourselves, burden ourselves, until we have compassion fatigue, but we can't fix it all. There is actually a biblical character who exemplifies this too in the New Testament. The Pharisees maybe exemplify the love of God becoming sort of overwhelming of our religious experience. The guy who exemplifies the love of neighbor overwhelming our religious experience is Judas. Judas, you may remember, was at table with Jesus. He was reclining at a table when a woman came and did something that was entirely ineffective and inefficient at fixing the problems of the world. She took an expensive jar of ointment and she poured it on his feet and bathed his feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. Remember the story? One of the Gospels said Judas was indignant and said we should have taken that ointment and we should have sold it and given the money to the poor. Now, it also says Judas didn't really care about the poor. He was a thief, and he kept the common purse. He just wanted to take from it. But that may well also have been true. But I think Judas's attitude actually makes sense of Judas more throughout the story as a whole. Like, how does he get to the point of betraying Jesus? Because he wants his religion, he wants the man he's following to fix things, to address the love of neighbor problems of the world that are all around him. And Jesus, while he does a lot of it, seems too happy to have his feet anointed and not fix things. Just fix it, Jesus. And I remind you, it takes both Judas and his frustration with Jesus' inefficiency and the Pharisees to get to the cross. They work together. Now, God doesn't need our stuff, right? He doesn't actually need ointments otherwise, but we do need to love God with our very best, because when we stop doing that, we lose our impulse towards beauty and transcendence. We kind of lose the source and grounding of our love. And then our religion becomes community service burdened by all these rites and rituals that really lead to wide-ranging inefficiencies as a service delivery organization. Like, this is not the most effective way for us this morning to go feed the poor, if that's really what it is, the only thing we're doing. Right? So we're inefficient as a community service organization, and that makes us tired, and then we become tired and angry because we can't do it all, because we can't save the world. It turns out Jesus already saved the world. It's important to remember. But when we make the organizing principle of our faith the love of neighbor and not the love of God, then we have to find something else to organize around. Many churches choose politics. They become little political clubs. It's one way to do it. But we can find all sorts of ways to organize that are not God. But we will end up tired and angry and exhausted at our relative impotence in the world. Both the Old and the New Testaments, they remind us you will always have the poor with them. You will always have neighbors that need to be loved. Not to remind us that we don't need to worry about it, but to remind us that solving that problem cannot become our God. That we have to take our love of God and then love our neighbor with it. Now, maybe you can identify in your own life which way you lean. I think, like I said, I think most of us have a natural tendency, if you will. Part of what God gives us in the church is a chance to come together with people whose natural tendencies are the other way, right? And thus help straighten us out. But if you can sort of sense whether just dry perfectionism or angry exhaustion is your spiritual danger, well then I want to close with a word of hope that I think is embedded in Jesus' response. Like, we get so used to the way this story goes. Like, the man asked the question, what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. But there's a way Jesus answers it, like specifically answers it. He gets tested, tried. And this guy is coming to him like antagonistically, not friendly. Right? Jesus doesn't just give him the answer. He actually, it's even clearer in the Greek, but the way he says it is he says love. Like, that's Jesus' first response to this man who's coming at him angry. He just says love. It's the second person singular. It's not you, like y'all should love the Lord your God. It's you. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. He answers the Pharisees' like pretentious question with a direct command, an invitation to put away the pretense of arguing, the dry perfectionism that makes him think he needs to judge Jesus, the dryness of his ritually perfect life. The Son of God meets the man right there and tells him not what he needs to know, not even what he wants to know, but he tells him what he needs to do, to love. And it's such an act of grace that even when he's being tested and tried, the Son of God never ceases to reach out, to try, to grab that man with an invitation, to say, look, let this go. Let this questioning, tempting thing go and love. Even when the human beings are out trying to get him, Jesus reaches out to try and get them to love. Now, I don't know if the lawyer takes him up on it, but we can. Love. If you find yourself on the love of God side with it emphasized and separating, you downplayed the love of neighbor, then this week, find a moment to love your neighbor. The solution to that problem is to go do the other thing. Right? And likewise, if you've been loving your neighbor really well, then take some time to just love and adore God in prayer. Just love him with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul. Jesus doesn't tell us what we need to know. He tells us what we need to do. And we can't skip doing either half, the greatest commandment or the second one that is like unto it. We have to do them both.